Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michelle D'Amico, and I'm the Director for Non-Credit and Public Programs at the NYU SPS Center for Global Affairs, or CGA. The CGA is currently celebrating its 15th year preparing global citizens. We do this through our public events, such as this, robust non-credit programs, and 2 graduate programs, one in global affairs and a recently launched MS in global conflict, security, and cybercrime. In addition to our programming in global affairs, we are also home to the George H. Heyman Jr. program for philanthropy and fundraising. Through our open enrollment courses and a certificate in fundraising, we prepare professionals for impactful careers in fundraising. These courses are taught by fundraising practitioners and experts who have impressive experience in leading fundraising teams and organizations across a variety of sectors, and they bring to the classroom key insights into the complexity and scope of real-world challenges encountered on the job. We'll send out a follow-up email to all attendees, so please feel free to reach out with any questions you may have about these programs. Now for some housekeeping for today's webinar. If you have a question for any of our speakers, please use the raise your hand tool. We will take questions in the order that they come in and unmute you so you can verbally ask your question. You should note that if you ask your question verbally, your name as it appears in the session will be seen by attendees. If you wish to remain anonymous, please send your question to us via the Q&A option. Finally, we will be recording today's session. The identities of those who ask questions will be removed from the recording before distribution. Now to today's moderator. Bianca Derouene is the president and founder of Aperio Philanthropy, a fundraising consulting firm that provides nonprofits hands-on support with relationship-based fundraising. Aperio works with nonprofits of all sizes, from startup to national organizations. Prior to founding Aperio, Bianca served in leadership roles at the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society and the American Red Cross, in addition to serving as a consultant to various smaller organizations. I'm very delighted to highlight that she is an alum of our MS in Global Affairs program here at CGA. So without further ado, I'd like to turn this over to Bianca for today's presentation.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you to you and your team for co-hosting today's webinar. For those of you who haven't had a chance to check out the Center for Global Affairs webinar series in the past few months, I highly recommend it. You can find the recordings on their Facebook at NYU Center for Global Affairs, or if you like spelling a lot of letters, at NYU SPS CGA, highly recommended. Before we get started in our conversation today, I'd like to introduce you to our illustrious panel that you can see on your screen here. And then we're going to dive into a discussion of our topic at hand, pivoting and preparing for an uncertain future. So to start with Amy Beros, Amy has spent 15 years in the nonprofit fundraising space. She's passionate about furthering causes that are making a significant impact in the community. Amy currently serves as the Managing Director, Strategic Capacity Development at Feeding America, overseeing a team who provides fundraising support and consulting services to the network of 200 food banks nationwide. Prior to her work with Feeding America, Amy was VP of Development at the Food Bank of Central and Eastern North Carolina. Moving on to Channon Lucas. Channon is Chief Administrative Officer at the Mother Cabrini Health Foundation, which provides grants to improve the health and well-being of vulnerable New Yorkers, bolster the health outcomes of diverse communities, eliminate barriers to care, and bridge gaps in health services. Channon was one of the first employees of the foundation in its inaugural year of 2018. Previously, she served as Vice Chancellor of the Archdiocese of New York, where she oversaw the daily operations of 14 functional departments and served as special advisor to the Archbishop for the Archdiocese charitable works. Channon has also worked on various New York State political campaigns as a fundraiser. Like me, she is also a CGA alum and currently serves on the program's advisory board. Alice O'Rourke is Chief Revenue Officer for MakeAWish America, where she's responsible for leading the national organization in 60 chapters in growing their revenue to grant more wishes for children with critical illnesses. Previously, Alice served as Chief Executive Officer of the Diabetes Research Institute Foundation and Chief Development Officer at the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. She also served as Vice President of Division Fundraising at the American Red Cross, where she oversaw the Northeast region's fundraising response to several natural disasters, including Superstorm Sandy. Prior to joining the nonprofit sector, Alice served in leading or senior roles on the business development teams for 2 prestigious law firms and a Fortune 100 company. Alice is also an attorney, so watch out. Mark Roithmayr is Chief Executive Officer, I gave you a new title, Mark, of the Alzheimer's Drug Discovery Foundation, which is the leading nonprofit funder of drugs to prevent and treat Alzheimer's disease. He has helped to increase ADDF's revenue threefold to $60 million and was instrumental in securing the donations of Bill Gates and Jeff and Mackenzie Bezos. Mark previously served as Chief Relationship Officer at the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, and prior to that, he served as the first president of Autism Speaks and held several executive positions with the March of Dimes, where he also led response to major disasters here in New York, including 9/11. So with that, welcome panelists. Thank you for agreeing to join us today. Some of you more willingly than others. To get started here, CGA's webinars that I mentioned earlier have been exploring the far-reaching consequences of the COVID crisis on global affairs. Today, we're going to focus in on a sector that has been both essential to the response, but also heavily impacted by the crisis, and that's nonprofits. This crisis has demonstrated yet again how much we need nonprofits. There are some needs in our communities that governments simply can't fill and companies can't fill. Those needs have to be filled by neighbors helping neighbors. And we're seeing here in this COVID crisis that this is so true, that it's nonprofits who are stepping up to heal and feed and shelter and educate and entertain and support our communities through this isolation and are beginning to recover. This crisis, though, has hit nonprofits hard. On the one end of the spectrum, we have those organizations on the front lines who have just been inundated by demands and fundraising efforts and stretched beyond their capacity. On the other end of the spectrum, we have organizations who've seen their funding dry up and they're wondering whether they can even stay in business. I think most organizations are somewhere in the middle where we're plugging along for now, but we're starting to wonder, what's coming next in this uncertain future ahead of us. Nonprofit leaders, as these folks are going to share with you, are starting to recognize that the COVID crisis is not just a blip. It's not a pause from our reality on the operational side or on the fundraising side. It's a fundamental shift in the landscape of how we deliver our mission and how we fund our work. So our conversation today is going to zoom in on 3 questions. 1, how has the crisis impacted nonprofits, and especially on the fundraising side? 2, what can we learn from past crises like 9/11, the Great Recession, Superstorm Sandy, recognizing that no crisis is alike? And 3, what can we do to pivot and prepare for the next year and a half? So without further ado, we'll start the discussion here. I'll start with that first question, the impact of this crisis on nonprofits and funding. Amy, Feeding America has been at the front lines of the response and certainly at the front lines of that inundation I mentioned earlier. Tell us about what your network is experiencing.
Sure, it is. It's been astonishing. I'll say that. I've been in food banking through some pretty significant disasters throughout the years, but this is certainly unlike anything else. Because of the type of crisis that we're in, food banks have really had to change their business model overnight. For those not familiar with food banking, volunteers typically more than double the staff at food banks, and they are really the way that the communities are served by helping package and distribute product and food. Most of the food banks' donations of food is from retailers and manufacturers and the distributions take place at pantries and faith-based organizations across the country. So with this crisis, volunteers are severely limited, if being allowed at all, depending on the different food banks and what their protocols are. So that is limiting abilities to help repackage and distribute the food. Donations of food are almost non-existent because of the supply chain challenges that everyone has heard about in the news. So food banks are really competing with retailers, their previous donors on the open market to be able to purchase food. I heard from one food bank recently that in a typical month they spend about $50,000 on food, and now they're spending more than $1 million a month on food to purchase. So typically they were paying for transportation to get food to them, but now they're paying for that plus the cost of the food. And also trying to redistribute the food in socially distanced ways creates another logistical need. So food banks have really done an absolutely phenomenal job to pivot to meet this new way of doing business. And at the same time that they are pivoting their business model, as you all know, the need is skyrocketing in communities due to the unemployment and closure of businesses. So from a fundraising perspective, thankfully the community is responding through support. And this is certainly the first time in my lifetime that I have felt that hunger is not hidden in the United States. It's a chance for food banks and Feeding America as well to really share what hunger looks like year round every year. And because of this pandemic, putting the focus on hunger relief and the work that food banks are doing at the front line, food banks have that opportunity to share that story on a more global level. From the impact, it's, while the community is responding very, very generously from a fundraising perspective, we are still really estimating what that need is and how long that need is going to continue.
Thanks for sharing, Amy. Turning over to Alice, tell us a little bit about what MakeAWish is experiencing, and certainly your chapters across the country.
Sure. Well, I'd say the pivot here is both existential and exciting. As Stanford economist Paul Romer said, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste, and we're certainly not wasting it. At MakeAWish, we're looking at our mission, we're looking at our fundraising, and we're looking at the future of the organization. So just a little background on MakeAWish. We grant the wishes of seriously ill children, and it's so much more than the wish that's granted. It's the entire journey of identifying the wish and the power that children regain over their life, and the opportunity to get their childhood back, as much as the wish itself. And then, of course, then there's the lifelong change that's brought about as a result of the wish experience. 86% of our wishes are wishes to travel. So guess what? We're having a hard time right now granting those wishes. And our kids are going to be some of the last people to start traveling again. And yet we must keep granting wishes for two reasons: that the kids need the hope, the strength, and the joy that the wish granting brings. And also we need to be raising money, so we need to be granting wishes. So we are recreating the wish experience right now. And I'll just give you one example. Kids asked to go to spend some time with a celebrity, and the celebrities are incredible, really they are. And yet there's a limited time and experience. We had a young man ask to meet DJ Khaled, and DJ Khaled spent 1 hour and 45 minutes in a complete bro talk with this young guy who's like 18 or 19. This would never happen. I mean, it just can't happen if the wish were to hook up with him directly. And so we're discovering that some of our wish replacements can be better than what the original wish was going to be. So one, we're relooking at how we see that these travel wishes especially get granted as soon as possible. On the fundraising side, we are pivoting to relationship-based fundraising with a vengeance. And this movement is coming from the ground up. It's not, national saying, it's time to do this, kids. The chapters are saying we need to do this. This is, of course, because events revenue is uncertain. So relationship fundraising means to us, of course, relationships in all of its carnations, from principal, major, middle, annual, sustainer. Every form of relationship-based fundraising is getting a new and a vigorous and creative look right now. And then I'll end with the future. MakeAWish had its 40th anniversary this year, and we were already working at what the next 40 years were going to be like, how the leadership team that's there now is going to see that this organization is strong for the next 40 years. And so as you might imagine, COVID has put a real exclamation point on that, whether it's wishes, fundraising that I've already spoken about, community, technology, really where we're looking at the business from the ground up. So that's what's going on the ground at MakeAWish, Bianca.
Thanks, Alice. It sounds
Sure.
exciting, even if a lot of big changes that can be scary as well. Thanks for sharing. Mark, what about you over at Alzheimer's?
So at the Alzheimer's Drug Discovery Foundation, just a little bit of background. One, founded by the Lauder family, and that's as in the Estee Lauder Corporation, the Lauder family. And we just fund one very specific type of research, and we do this through a venture philanthropy model. And with that as background, I want to ask that all the fundraisers on this webinar today don't hate me, because our impact is on the financial side is probably less than most for a couple of reasons. One, there is a trust from the Lauder family that covers all of the expenses of the organization, and that trust goes out several years. So day one from stay at home, we were able to tell our employees, hey, everybody has their job for the foreseeable future. That's number one. Number two, I want to get into our fundraising model, because it has been affected, but in very interesting ways. Our model is 25% events, 75% major gifts, and I'm going to talk about the events and the gifts. The other piece is we have a third revenue stream, and that comes with venture philanthropy. We only do scientific grants in our funding, but they're really not grants, they're contracts, whether it's to an academic institution or to a biotech. There is a contract signed, and there's a return on investment that we can see depending on how that science progresses through the clinical trial process. And I bring that up because we've already this year, since the crisis started, had one significant return on investment from one of our science projects, and we're probably going to have another one by the end of the year. All right, so that's the part that I want you to not hate me about. Let me talk about, because of course it's affecting fundraising, it's affecting everybody's fundraising. This is teaching us on our spring events, and we had we have the claim to fame of the last event that happened in Palm Beach before everything got shut down. We had 3 more events this spring that obviously aren't going off in the way that we thought they were going to go off. We view our events as vehicles for giving. And if there's one big piece of advice I could give here, is that COVID is bringing us back to this fact that events should be vehicles for giving. And if everybody can get in that ballroom or get out on those streets and give the money, that's great. But it's a vehicle, and the relationship to give should still be there with or without the vehicle. Why do I say that? We pulled together our co-chairs of our events that couldn't happen in a ballroom this spring. And we have begun to do things we never would have done left to ourselves. And we believe we've come up with a formula, actually, which is obviously, the words pivot and repurpose are so overused now, but rightfully so, because everything's getting repivoted or pivoted and repurposed. But with our events, we're finding that through Zoom, no more than, and these are fundraising events, that we're going to be luncheons or gala dinners, no more than an hour, an element of some kind of celebrity, an element of mission, and an element of emotion. And for instance, I'll give you that we have a great ladies luncheon, which is a luncheon, fashion show, and symposium in Washington, D.C. every year. It was supposed to be the end of April. We just did it a week or two ago. It was a 1-hour stream. It started with Andrea Mitchell, the NBC correspondent, who's been part of the event for years, interviewing 2 docs about what's the latest in Alzheimer's science. Then it had local hockey star TJ Oshie, who plays for the Washington Capitals, from his home, talking about how he'd like to get back on the ice, but he's not sure when he's going to do it. And it showed him, he has a father with early onset Alzheimer's, talking about that. So there was some emotion. And then the last piece was the daughter of the founder talking about her grandmother, who the event was founded for, and talking about how terrific her mother was to have done this event for 10 years. And the event raised $450,000. It usually raises $600,000. However, and this is the last piece I'll say in events, it's now about the net, because we didn't feed 500 women in a ballroom in Washington, D.C. So our net is similar, even though the gross is less, right? So, and that's become a formula for us. Less than an hour, some celebrity, some emotion, some science, right? Because that's who we are. And it's about the net. On the major gifts, and I'm going to end it here, Bianca, but with the major gifts, it used to be, the phrase was, it's all about closing, right? Close it, close it, close it. And I'll come back later and talk more about this, but now it's all about stewarding right now. So, and that's something, Bianca, I'll come back a little bit later to chat about. And again, Bianca, it is terrific to be on. You didn't need to twist my arm. And Michelle, thank you for what you and all of NYU do.
Thank you, Mark. Channon, so over to you. I know you have had a sharp eye on sort of the nonprofit industry overall, and specifically here in New York. And I'm wondering if you can speak to, as you've been listening to your colleagues and talking with other fundraisers, what do you see as the biggest challenges and opportunities facing fundraisers today?
Thanks, Bianca, and thank you all for joining us today. I do want to quickly say that I also hope you don't hate Mark, because if you hate Mark, you might be after me with the pitchfork. We don't do any fundraising at Cabrini. We have been blessed that we have a corpus that's pretty substantial, and we can do okay without the fundraising. However, Bianca's point, what the Mother Cabrini Health Foundation does is we really focus on health and the social determinants of health. What we mean by that are all the things that make up a person's life that keep them from being vulnerable or susceptible to disease. Right now, as we all sit in our homes on Zoom, we hear about everybody sheltering at home. What happens if you don't have a home? So at Cabrini, we're not looking at just direct services, which we do, but also housing, education, food. Amy and Feeding America, what you guys are doing is so important right now. But in New York State, what I think COVID has done is really, really demonstrated that social safety net of nonprofits is so vital to keeping people in their homes well-fed and in the best health they can be. We have allocated about $50 million this year for COVID in New York State. And part of that is we knew out the gate, and a bigger step back, we're a brand new health foundation. Came into existence in 2018. Really started grant making last year. And we just announced our first round of grants from 2019 in February, and then suddenly this crisis is upon us. So our board and our CEO scrambled, and they got together and thought, this is what we are here to do. And so we are currently trying to respond to those needs. One of the things that struck me about this in the nonprofit fundraising space, prior to being at Cabrini, I ran the annual fund at the Archdiocese of New York. Annual funds are more important than ever before. And I say that, I'm sure there are some fundraisers on the line who know this. It's not always seen as the most sexy fundraising cause. Everybody loves a project or a gala or a specific pet cause, but the annual funds are really what's keeping people working, what's keeping employees, available to do the work that they do that's so necessary. And it's something right now that I think we have an opportunity to really educate our donors on what those funds do on an everyday basis. crisis. So I'm sure we'll talk a bit more. I love Mark touched on the event space a little bit, because I think that is so important as well, of really thinking back to the development of relationships, not just the cash in transaction of fundraising and development, but it's quite an interesting time. And I think it's a great opportunity to really look at how we can go back to basics with the development community.
Thanks, Shannon. So as we are all trying to pivot and innovate forward at this time, a lot of the conversation has been around, well, what can we learn from the past? How can we avoid making past mistakes or avoid missing opportunities, like you were just saying, Shannon? So I want to take us in the direction of talking about what we can learn from past crises. So I'm going to start with you, Mark, because I know you led a fundraising team during 9/11, and I want to get your thoughts on what can we learn from that particular crisis.
Sure. Couple things here. First of all, let me state, anything I've been through before, from 9/11 to the Great Recession to any number of storms, hurricanes, floods, and all of that, this is different. And at some point, if we want to get into that, we can. Having said that, I think the question's excellent, right? Because there are things absolutely to learn, you can learn. I will comment on 9/11. I was the executive director for the March of Dimes in New York City, 90% of our income coming from events. 1 mile from the Twin Towers. One of the great things the March of Dimes does is they train you in everything. Volunteers, fundraising. The one thing that you didn't have in a playbook was 2 planes just hit a building and it's a mile away. One of our staff was in one of those buildings earlier this morning. What do? You know, and learned a lot. But what I will say, there were 3, and I also, some of them may be on, but big shout outs to the people that I worked with in that office at that time, and the team of folks that was there. But 3 very key things that came away from that I believe are absolutely applicable to where we are now. Number 1 is to maniacally focus on the immediate steps in front of you. And there are 2 things tearing apart at that. Number 1, and see if this sounds familiar, hey, I'm kind of worried about my own health and safety. And number 2, oh my God, you know, the economy is going to hell. You know, what is this all going to mean? And those are very kind of nerve-wracking things. But to be able to, and I remember this, think of the 2, 3, 4 steps in front of you. There is a road out of this, right? There is a road out. And you got to make it devoid of your personal emotion of the moment and make it about the mission of your organization and your role in the mission of the organization. The second part of that, which goes immediately with the first, is pull those closest to you closer. There is an old adage that is in fundraising and in nonprofits that put a volunteer between you and an opportunity or a challenge. And I will never forget 9/11. Literally, we had a call out to board members to see if they were alive, all right? But in pulling those in close and in pulling the event chairs in close and focusing on the steps out, the path started becoming logical. I remember having to go over, this is 3 days, 72 hours after 9/11, to go see a CEO of a company who was chairing the event that was happening October 11th. And I had to go into his office, and he had a subsidiary company. He was an engineer with a subsidiary company that they still thought engineers of theirs might be in the sub-basements of the Twin Towers and could still be alive because they were still digging through. And I had to go see him and talk to him about, were we doing this event or not? And I remember, you know, we checked in with each other, or we were safe, what was going on. And then I said, Dominic, I need to bring up the event and, you know, what you're thinking about with this event. And he looked at me and he said, "Hey, you, Mr. Executive Director." He said, put his finger kind of at me. And he said, "I want to know what you're thinking. I want to know what you're thinking." And I said, "Well, Dominic, I have to tell you, this is terrible. And I know you may have people that are still in the basement, and the March Time's about babies." I said, "But in the last 72 hours, there were babies still being born." I remember he pounded his chest, and he pounded his desk, and he said, "I'm so glad you said that, because if you told me we're going to cancel this event, I was going to quit the organization. We can't let these people win. We still have to continue with our lives." Next thing I knew, money was starting to flow back into the place. So pull those closest to you closer, because they're going to have opinions on this. It doesn't have to all be on your shoulders. And there are actually innovative ways out if we're listening. The last piece about this is about making your mission relevant in the moment. I will never forget this. It is now September 12th. Her name, she may even be on, our walk director, Agnes Pasquini, and a phenomenal fundraiser. And Agnes looked at me and I looked at her, and Lord knows what I looked like at that moment. And I said, "Agnes, I don't know." And she said to me, "Hey, Mark," and Bianca and Alice, you're going to both love this. He goes, "Hey, Mark, all of us want to go work and volunteer for the Red Cross right now. Our donors want to give to the Red Cross right now." And I'm like, "Agnes, what's your point?" But she's the first one that said to me and gave me the nerve to say it to an event chair. She said, "But Mark, babies are being born, and that's what we're here for. So we've got to get to that." And we figured out, okay, we started focusing on Lower Manhattan, the number of babies being born, how many were ending up in neonatal intensive care units, how the March of Dimes helps them, and kind of pivoted the mission to that moment that was relevant, right? And I'll tell you, it went all so well through the end of that year and the next year. I remember a year and a half later, I was promoted to head of revenue for the entire March of Dimes, because the CEO at the time said, all the other chapters are complaining about they can't raise money in this new environment, but our New York chapter is growing by double digits, right? And the 3 clear lessons: steps in front of you, pull those closest closer, make your mission relevant.
Wow, so well said, Mark. Thank you for sharing those 3 lessons with us. So Alice, as Mark alluded to, you and I were in the trenches at the Red Cross during Superstorm Sandy. And I know from my own personal experience, that was one of the biggest learning moments of my life. So I'm curious what lessons you draw from that experience.
Well, many, and thanks for the question. And I guess my disaster business development / fundraising experience covers 9/11, the dot-com bust, the Great Recession, Hurricane Sandy, and now this. So I feel like I'm finally developing a certain expertise in the field. But let me start with this. I guess first is check on the people closest to you. So I'll tell a quick story of checking on one of our donors at the Red Cross, learning that her home had been washed away by Hurricane Sandy. And every time we checked in, I asked her how her, getting back into her house was working. And then over time, it became, that conversation led to her engagement, and then it led to her new job. And when I saw her again 10 years later, it was the new baby. And so the relationships that you form in these crises can really last a very long period of time. So check on people. I had the head of Google sales and myself checking on each other. No matter how big and no matter how bad and no matter how important you are, it still is nice to get checked on. So the next one is really in what Mark said, is that you've got to be relevant in a crisis, no matter what it is that you're doing. And I'm going to actually credit you, Bianca, in a conversation we had about, if you're not relevant now, you're not going to be later. And from all of these crises, I know that for such a long period of time, people ask you, well, what did you do in whatever it was? And so whatever our audience, whatever you're doing, you've got to believe that what you're doing is relevant now, because you are not going to be relevant later. You just won't have a story of relevance to tell. I'm in a really lucky position because hope is essential. It's always relevant as long as the people who work at Make-A-Wish believe that and will tell that story, then we're always going to be relevant, rain or shine. For those that are in, as we were at the Red Cross, the first line of response, God bless you, as we used to say at the Red Cross, because the great challenge we had at the Red Cross was we had 10 years worth of donors come in the blink of an eye. And I know the very same thing happened to ALS with the Ice Bucket Challenge. It's probably happening in food banks now. So our greatest challenge coming out of the 500-year storm that Hurricane Sandy was, where Bianca and I were part of the team that raised $200 million as opposed to the 65 we were supposed to have only raised, is that we had 10 years worth of donors and we had to really quickly figure out how to prioritize those for giving that would go past the disaster. So it was just a time of incredible innovation. And once again, something not to waste. So I feel your pain if you're dealing with that right now, but what a great opportunity it is. We also experienced at Sandy, maybe just 2 more points, that, we found that certain giving was advanced, but I can tell you, go out and ask, keep on asking. Some people will tell you they advanced their gift, but others are going to appreciate the great job you did, all of that stewardship, that checking in, the relevance. They're going to appreciate the story that you tell of how you're changing your organization as a result of it. So if you get turned down the first couple of times, I'd keep going. And then I think finally, at the Red Cross, there was a real lesson to be learned as an organization around what do you do when you raise way more money that you can put to work anytime soon, and the kinds of partnerships that you can form that do your constituency, position them for a much better future, and also just reflect so positively on the sophistication of the organization that you're in, and show your donors how well you are stewarding their dollars. So those are some of the lessons from Sandy.
Thanks, Alice. Channon, you were also fundraising in New York during that time and some of the other disasters that have been brought up. What are the lessons that you've learned?
Yeah, so I would say one of the things that we did at the Archdiocese, I was there during the recession and Sandy. I would also kind of give 3 quick steps. And the first is to listen, to really understand what folks are needing on the ground and how you can respond as a fundraiser. Secondly, I would say really strip it down, right? Who are you as an entity? What are you focused on doing? So the Catholic Church in New York, Staten Island was hit very hard in Sandy, and Staten Island has a lot of Catholic parishes, a lot of Catholic families. And a lot of those families were coming to their pastor saying, help, I don't have food, I don't have clothing, I don't have diapers. And so what happened at the Archdiocese, Cardinal Dolan's leadership, along with Catholic Charities and our Vicar General, who's the number 2 to the Cardinal, and also happens to be my CEO now at Cabrini, but they really put together a quick plan to respond directly, to give, resources to those priests in that community, to put cash in the hands of families who really had nothing at that moment. It's not our usual way of operating, but they found a workaround, and they leaned into, we're family. And you come to that family every single Sunday, and you sit in the pews and you sit next to your neighbors. And we found folks really wanted to respond. And so my last suggestion is to act quickly. And I know that we can all sit around and debate whether or not we should do something or how we should respond to a crisis, but I think they really had a lot of great foresight to say, people want to give, let's listen to what they're trying to give and how they're trying to respond locally and then also beyond. And I think even now with COVID, I'm thinking about the diocese, I'm not there anymore, but you had that captive audience every Sunday. You don't have that anymore. So you really got to lean into those major donor relationships, those not even major donors, I would say general operating fund donors who are consistently giving to you, and check in with them. That's a great piece of advice from both Alice and from Mark. but also, you know, really say to them, this is the time that we need you. I know there's a lot of voices, a lot of noise going on right now where a lot of people are focused only on COVID giving, but life goes on in other areas of giving as well. So yes, definitely I listen and hear what people are needing, and then also what your donors are looking to support.
Thanks, Shannon. Pivoting over to you, Amy, I know you said that this is a crisis that's brought, you know, visibility that you've never seen before in your fundraising career to the issue of hunger, but certainly Feeding America and the network of food banks has been in the disaster response business for a long time. Tell us a little bit about how you're adapting lessons from the past to what you're doing today.
Sure, and there's been such great advice shared already, and really, you know, Feeding America is and the network of food banks are doing similar to all that you've heard from the panelists. I started my career just before the Great Recession in fundraising, so I was in the for-profit sector and moved over, so it was an interesting time to join fundraising. And since my time with the food bank and networks, experienced some pretty significant disasters, and as everyone has said, and as you know, this is just so different. Typically in a disaster, the Feeding America network is able to activate really quickly because it's localized to a certain area. We can mobilize funds, people, infrastructure to that area. This is happening to the entire country, as well as our donors. They're in it right there with us. And, you know, Feeding America thinking about how to compare this to previous recessions to help model, just like everyone else, we are looking at the recession. We're looking at 9/11. We're looking at the donors that came in during those types of events that did affect the whole country, as well as in disasters like Katrina that was more localized but still happened on a national level, and Superstorm Sandy. So that is how we're building our fundraising models. But in terms of how we are looking at our fundraising strategy, it is, I will steal a term from one of my team members because I love it. It's studivation. So it's stewardship and cultivation all in one. Prior to this disaster, we had a trend that's happening for many nonprofits, that we were seeing less donors giving more. Acquisition and building that donor pipeline has been a huge concern for the network. And historically, 20 years ago, the network was really fundraising built around direct marketing. And we know that the world has changed. There's so many new ways to give. So over the past decade, really focusing on relationship management. Certainly this heightens that need for relationship management and connecting with your donors, but because of the new donors coming in and people that, you know, not just new donors to the food bank, but people that haven't been philanthropic before and are now thinking about philanthropy in a different way because what is happening and what they have and what they're seeing on the news. How do we connect with those annual fund donors, and how do we enact our studivation to make sure they feel connected to us? So just make up words. That's what we do at Feeding America. But yeah, so sharing knowledge is really our power right now, sharing that impact. And that's internal with our network, our 200 food banks. We're doing town halls like this every week with the fundraisers in our network to share what's working in your area. What are you doing that's not working? How are your donors engaging? Because it has impacted the different communities at different times and in different ways. But we're recommending that the food banks do that same thing with their donors. Have these town halls with your donors, with your major donors. Make it very exclusive and intimate, where there's 10 major donors and your CEO and one of your board members talking about the response. For your annual fund donors, having large town halls to talk about your response, talk about what you're seeing, talk about how people can help. Because people do want to help right now. And that's not just for Feeding America and food banks. They want to help their community. You know, it's the same as the shop local, support local. You are a community asset as an organization in your town, in your community, in your state, in the country. So you are relevant. This is Feeding America's time. This is food banks' time on the media, but that doesn't mean it's not your time because you're not getting the media right now. So certainly sharing why you are important with your donors, sharing what's happening at your organization. And that's all we're doing from a food bank perspective. Ours is just heightened because of the situation, but it's really just connecting. Exactly what other folks said, checking in. First asking how they're doing, then talking about what the impact is and how you're doing and how the community's doing and how they can get involved. So my last piece of advice and something that I encourage is to say no sometimes. We used to ring a bell in my former role when folks would say no to something because we're fundraisers, we are, nonprofit professionals, and we want to say yes to everything. We want to help, we're helpers, but sometimes you have to say no. So really prioritizing the highest ROI activities that will help you and your organization, which in the turn is your mission, is going to help your community that you're serving the best way. So if you have to say no, sometimes it's okay, and not to be hard on yourself about doing that.
That's such good advice. I'm thinking of some of the strange in-kind donation offers we got at the Red Cross after every disaster. People offloading, truckloads of pink flip-flops and other strange things. In any case, moving on to kind of our next question here of what does the next 8 or 12 to 18 months look like and how do you prepare for that? As Mark was saying earlier, I think I agree, this crisis is really unlike anything I've seen in my lifetime, but I think one of the aspects that's most challenging is that we don't know where we are in the crisis. So unlike a hurricane, when you know when you're in the disaster, you know when you're in the immediate response, you know when you're in long-term recovery, this crisis is on its own little trajectory. And I think, like so many of the crises we've discussed, it impacts so many aspects of our life. It's not a health crisis. It's not a financial crisis. It's not a mental health crisis or a community crisis or a hunger crisis. It's all of those things. So as we've been talking with fundraisers as a firm, the question we keep getting is, I barely know how to plan 3 weeks ahead right now, personally or professionally, never mind on a strategic plan front. How on earth am I supposed to plan for the next 12 to 18 months? How am I supposed to know what I should be doing with my events or my priorities or my board members or my, limited expense budget? Where should I be investing that? So I'd like to, in light of, your experience with crises, what you're doing in your own organization, what you wish you were doing in your organization, get all of your thoughts on that question of where we go next. So Alice, I'll start with you on this one, and maybe you can kick off the discussion sharing a little bit about what do you think is going to change about fundraising in the next 12 to 18 months as a result of the consequences of this crisis?
Well, thanks for asking me the hardest question first. So, and I'm not going to punt. I'm going to try and answer your question, but I am going to tell you that in trying to get a feel for what is going on in the industry of many of our corporate sponsors, either I or members of my team have been on quarterly analyst calls because it's that season right now. And I just, before I get put to on the hot seat to answer this question, need to tell you that on those calls, many a CEO said, it's just we know this and this and this, and it's just too early to tell this and this and this. So with that backdrop, I'll be happy to tell you, I think one of the things that a crisis does is help you realize that if there was a sort of fundamental weakness in your program that you really need to fix. And as a now, 3-4 time nonprofit, executive, it's really interesting that at every organization that I've been at, the most fundamental problem that we needed to fix was that we were raising the amount of money that equaled the equity, the brand equity of the reputation and the impact of the organization. So there was always a gap between how much money we were raising and what that equity was. And the number one way to close that gap is for your employees first to become true believers in what the equity is. So, let me just give you one example from Leukemia and Lymphoma, where you, Mark, and I worked. Everybody there could tell you why we couldn't raise funds. We didn't have a hospital. We didn't have grateful patients. We didn't own the research. We didn't have this. We didn't have that. And what we had to do before we were going to rethink our future was to come back and prove to our own staff that we had everything we needed to raise every dollar that we had a vision for. And so, and that was, we had been behind virtually every modern treatment for blood cancer in the last 18 months. There had been 15 that we had invested in. We had 1,000 world-class scientists, 5 of whom were Nobel laureates. And so the point of the story is every organization that I've ever worked in has a why we can't, and they have a why we can and should be able to realize the full value of our equity. And I think a situation like this makes you realize that you have to fix the fundamentals, and that would be one that I would point to. In terms of, you know, anything new that we haven't spoken about before, I'd say that we are trying to think of, I mean, certainly there has, I think one thing that we are doing at Make-A-Wish that may be relevant to those federated organizations that are out there is that we have found, as I have found in other disasters, that the we and the they of chapter and national, gone. All right, this is the time where you need everybody. It's a community, and no one has the solution, but we all together will have the solution, and to Mark's point, the path forward. So that's a thing of beauty, and I've seen that again at every single organization. The people who were the theys are now the my best buds, and that's going to last for a long time after that. And then just one other point on the federated model. You know, that we, they of what you do and what we do is also giving away, as the chapters need to think, what do we need to do? What's essential? What can we afford to do? Who can we afford to keep doing what? Oh, you know, there's just so much more willingness to think about doing things that were, you know, yeah, if we nice to haves, like sharing data and adopting best practices and business models that exist around stewardship, middle giving, annual giving, data, protocols. All that is now on demand, in big demand. So I think it's a great opportunity to bring all the we's and they's in your organization. I hate to sound like Pollyanna, but crises make friends, and you make them fast and they can last. So those will be my 2 messages. Fix the fundamental things that are holding you back and embrace your new friends.
We got a little into Dr. Seuss territory there with the rhyming too, Alice.
Oh, did I? I missed it. I'm just naturally a poet, apparently.
So Amy, what would you add to that? I imagine you're seeing certain trends as you're starting to forecast forward, and what are some of the things you're doing to prepare for that uncertain future?
Well, I certainly agree with a lot of what Alice said. It is very kumbaya. We are all in this together, and it makes it easier. You know, one of the fundraisers said on one of our town halls, I like coming here every week just because it's a pep talk and I realize I'm not alone. And I think right now we all need that. So being there for each other is really important. As we look ahead, I guess the bright spot is that nobody has this figured out. None of our corporate sponsors, the government, no nonprofit, Feeding America, food banks, none of us have a magic crystal ball to tell us what to plan for. So there's a lot of grace being given, which is appreciated during a time like this. So we have really smart people on our team thinking about what does the model look like. You know, we certainly hope that the COVID line will go down as, you know, infections go down, but we know that the need in our communities from a food bank perspective is not going to have that same model, and it's going to take years. So what does the community response continue to look like, and how many years forward can we try to project that? The community is responding with fundraising, but we're spending it as fast as they're responding right now. So how can we keep that community response at the level that it is, and show that need. So we're looking at how do we change our narrative. Certainly, we were able to revisit our case for support very quickly because of this heightened need, but what does that narrative look like in recovery versus response? So that's what we're trying to build out right now, and really thinking about, budgets. It's budget time for so many of our food banks. It's not going to look like it does before, and so many of our food banks are doing 3-month rolling budgets instead of an annual budget, and they've started to source that with some foundations. And because there's not an answer, folks are being really supportive of understanding that you're planning for the best that you can right now. And that's a huge mind shift for boards and finance committees to think about having a 3-month approved budget versus an annual budget. But we're also looking at how does this change our strategic priorities. Over the years, it's been you grow, you grow, you grow, because we're not meeting the need. We know that we're not serving everyone who needs food in our community. So we have to grow our distributions each year. We have to grow our programs. We have to look at ways to shorten the line, is what we say at Feeding America. But we know we still have to do that. But I think this brought to light that there's also some really foundational pieces that will change in our strategic priorities around just infrastructure and technology. We are not who we were in January, and we're not going to be those people again. So who are we now, and how do we move forward with the knowledge that we have now and the experience that we've had now to be able to best serve our communities?
I think there are a lot of organizations out there that are getting to that realization of we are not who we were a few months ago, and who are we? I think it's really well said, Amy. So Shannon, pivoting to you, we had one of the refrains from earlier in our conversation was the need to connect with donors and connect with them authentically and regularly. And of course, now we're on quarantine day, I don't know, 6,000 or something. The way we connect with people is a little different now. And so I'm wondering if you can give the audience some practical ideas for how to engage donors today for this moment where we are right now in the crisis.
Sure, Bianca. And if I can, I'm going to tell a little bit of a story that kind of ties to NYU. About 10 years ago, I happened to have lunch with Naomi Levine, who is the founder of the Heyman Center, and my boss at the Archdiocese, Helen Lowe, two great titans of fundraising and development. And Naomi was chuckling a little bit about all of these sort of trends and fundraising, right? She had gotten a piece of mail with a QR code to scan and, fill out your information. And her point was, this is nonsense. Development is the relationships. And what you always have to do is to lean into those relationships. I bring up Helen. Helen was my boss for 10 years at the Archdiocese, and she retired. And I mean, she retired a while ago. I don't know if I can use the word retired, but she kept calling it her going away party. But Helen's point to us was she came in a little tearful, and she shared that she doesn't have any friends to invite to this retirement party. And as she goes through her contacts and Outlook, all she sees are donors. And I used to have friends. What happened to my friends? I actually think that's a testament to what everybody in this room does, that you build true, genuine, authentic relationships with the people you encounter every day. Because when the time comes where you actually need a gift, they want to give not only to the organization, but to you. And this is a great time to check in on those folks, to really have those conversations and build those relationships. Mark earlier talked a little bit about net and events. I think that's a great moment to think about what doesn't work. Do you need to be feeding everybody? You can have a great event on Zoom. You can have a great event on a phone call. You can have a lot of outreach that's impactful to people and not have to put in, that actual investment of lunches and meals and entertainment. And not that they're not fabulous. I'm sure you all throw wonderful events, but really leaning back into kind of the basics of what everyone here got involved in this industry to do, which is to improve lives.
So Mark, I'm going to ask you the hardest question, I think, is what's not going to change? What's staying the same?
Right.
I think I'm going to be very impressed.
So there's a couple of things, and I even want to, first of all, this panel is great. I have a ton of notes I've been taking during this, and Studivation, love it. Everybody. Half a step back for a second, because as I was listening to all these answers, I was reminded 2 weeks ago we had our quarterly board meeting, and I went in there, okay, here's what 2020 looks like, down to, like every paperclip we may or may not use and all of that. And it's a great presentation, answered everything anybody could ask. And then the finance chair said, Mark, that was good, but I'm a little disappointed you don't have numbers laid out for 21 and 22. And Alice, thank you for that. First of all, great idea to sit in on those quarterly calls. But thank goodness, Leonard Lauder, who's the chair of our board, he's 87 years old. And Leonard, before I could say anything, Leonard on a Zoom, he goes, if Mark can answer that question, I'm taking all of Estee Lauder's money and betting it on whatever he says, because, and the phrase you keep seeing, we don't have that line of sight. We don't have that line of visibility right now. Having said that, I'm also going to say this crisis, different like any others, it reminds me of pieces of two things. 9/11 in that, and people forget this, but for months after, more than months after, people didn't feel safe. They didn't feel safe even going to work, okay? And then the Great Recession, as in, when is this gonna end, right? So those two elements are absolutely there. I also think, and I think a lot of this audience is from the New York area, I believe, from talking to a lot of people around the country, this is gonna be, it affects everywhere, but New York City, it's going to take a little bit longer. And if no other reason of how you get up in the elevators in the, into the building, right? We don't need to get into all that, but there's the density part of this is there. And I will also say to everybody that's on, because I talked to a lot of CEOs, in the first 3 or 4 weeks, I think this is week 10, Bianca, I think, but in the first 3 or 4 weeks, everybody was like, everything's now in the fall, right? We're all just, okay. Cancel that, but it's now in the fall. And I remember thinking, somebody said to me, the fall's going to be mental. It's Kentucky Derby, NHL playoffs, every gala, every wedding, right? All of this stuff going on. I don't hear that anymore. And I would tell you the stronger organizations I hear, they are in the process of or have repurposed their fall, whatever repurpose means, versus all those walkathons or all those galas or all those things are going to go off, because even if they could, how much are hundreds of people going to want to gather in one place? But your question was, okay, what stays the same? And I had a wonderful conversation with an old colleague of mine, Bill Sturdivant, who works for the Institute of Charitable Giving. And we were going through this whole thing of how this is different, this is different. And then he talked about, yeah, but here are some things that are the same. And I wrote these down. I did a blog not too long ago on this, but the 10 things that are this 10 truisms that are the same. 1, there are 2 things all donors hate: uncertainty and effect on their wealth. And at this point, I'm thinking, okay, Bill, great. This is helping me. Okay. 2, he said, as a staff, as a fundraisers, do not be presumptuous about other people's wealth. And the example he used is the recession, somebody who was worth $100 million and now was only worth $80 million. And the fundraisers at his university were saying about this person, well, they still have 80 million, so they could just still write a check. Don't be presumptuous about other people's wealth. 3, stay in touch, not to advance a gift, but rather to deepen the relationship and listen. And I think we've heard a lot of that today. 4 was, you have to expect that every top donor may temporarily replace you with, I don't know, Amy, you'll love this, but how many of us on this Zoom are giving to food banks now and never gave to them before, right? It's not hidden anymore, right, Amy? So, but they will come back. All right, and you have to expect that even with your top donors, that timing and amount could be effective. And this is a time to look at your donors. Are you in their top 3? And the old school thinking of this is their alma mater, their church or synagogue, and then you. Are you in the top 3? And if you're in the top 3, you need to be staying close with relationships and asking simple questions. How are you? How is this affecting your job? How is this affecting your family, right? The next piece, I think I'm up to 6 here. It doesn't mean you don't ask now. And the longer this goes on, the more am I seeing that. I think at first, the first 2, 3, 4 weeks, okay, but you know, the hospital systems didn't get overrun. Food is needed. Yes, it is. But you can start asking and acknowledge if the timing is weird. Look, I know it's what I realize now it's what I did with that volunteer back in 2001. Yeah, but Dominic, babies are being born right now. So you can acknowledge the moment, but you can ask, and you have to pivot to your mission. It's awkward now, there's the COVID, but I need to ask, I talked to another CEO, how many of you out there, July 1st is your fiscal year? So you've got year-end gifts you're looking to close in the next month. Use that. It's okay. Okay, it's awkward. I know you're probably giving all your money to Amy right now, but you know, last year you gave us 10,000. Could we be thinking about that again? But why? Because that's going to help our mission in this way, right? That goes. Always remember, and this is so hard, I have to put something up on the wall for me. All crises are terrible, but this too is going to end, all right? And when it does end, your donors, your volunteers are going to remember how well you dealt with this, right? And 10, how well you handle this crisis is going to be how quickly you move to new norms. And it's interesting because our director of major gifts in our office, he looked at not only where are we the top 3 for donors right now, but he looked below that where we're not. And his view is, I'm going to start getting even closer to those folks because I want when this ends, they're going to say, you know, my university just sent me emails, but Giorgio called me 3 times and kept asking me about my nephew or I mentioned, you know, blah, blah, blah. So there is a time to advance this. And then, so that's the 10. The last thing I will say, and I do think this is at least a New York thing, if not more, I don't think we don't fully begin to come full throttle out of this until there's a vaccine. You know, I've spent my career working between science, it's always been with science-based organizations. So the tension that we're all seeing, politics aside for a second, between business and science right now, I have worked for organizations on the boards, the business people say, why can't we have a cure tomorrow? And the science people say, that's not how science works, right? So I'm kind of comfortable in that space because I've been beaten up enough on both sides of that, right? Which is kind of, but ultimately this is going to be vaccines into everybody's arms before the full throttle opens up. So what are we doing in the meantime to make our mission work and continue to make our kind of cash flow? So with that, Bianca, I'll turn it back.
Thanks, Mark. Well, you've at least demonstrated that you're better at counting than I am. So thank you. Truisms. So we need to move on to audience Q&A, but I want to give the panelists, okay, you've got 1 or 2 sentences, parting thoughts for this group, knowing how much people are struggling, how hard it is to fundraise right now. 1 or 2 sentences, what do you want to leave them with? I'll start with you, Channon.
Thanks, Bianca. My 1 or 2 sentences are simple. Keep on doing the work you're doing. I know it's a tough environment right now. I know that there's a lot of things working against you, but you do have people at home who want to help. And I think there's always a way to translate your mission into what's happening at the moment. So, you know, keep on doing the great work.
Thanks, Channon. What about you, Amy?
That do not be shy. You are valuable, and this is not a time to go silent to your supporters and to your community.
Mark? Gotta unmute yourself, Mark. First time this happened today.
Pivot, repurpose, and unfortunately, think through the next 18 months?
I like Shannon's better. Alice?
Well, one thing about being a fundraiser is that almost everybody thinks that they can do it better than you. So I would say, ask me how I know that, but I'll have to tell you privately. But I would say that we are all fundraising professionals and we know what to do. And if you don't personally know, you have a network to access that is, like the people who I'm on this panel with, who I could call for anything, anytime. But you have boards second guessing you, CEOs second guessing you, you have people in operations second guessing you. I mean, anybody that could second guess a fundraiser, crisis or no, will. So, oops, did I say that? But just have the confidence in that this is a profession, and that there's an approach that works rain or shine in this profession, and please have the confidence of that. And then I guess the second thing is, and going back to Sandy, one thing I didn't mention was never underestimate the generosity of the American people. I mean, it's just like so unbelievably endless if you will make yourself relevant. And the thing that consistently touches me is that the people who are in that 100K and lower are the folks that time after time give more, whatever it is, of their salaries. So never underestimate the generosity of people. Those are my messages.
What a great place to end. Thanks, Alice. I'm going to turn it over to Michelle now to see if there are any questions in the queue.
So the first question is, I'm working on a virtual event for a smaller New York City focused nonprofit. Our biggest obstacle at the moment has been securing some kind of communication with a celebrity or someone with name recognition. How have you found success in connecting with celebrities and cutting through the noise of people wanting 5 minutes of their time?
Oh boy, Channon, do you want to take that one?
Channon or Alice? Alice is probably better than Channon in this situation.
Okay, go ahead, Alice.
I'm willing to take that one. I guess and maybe my last answer about trust yourself and don't be second guessed by everybody was a popular one, but this one may not be the popular answer, and that is, I would really think about, do you need a celebrity for the event? And whether it's more trouble than it's worth, and whether this is the time to try and build a new channel or muscle if you don't have that already. And then finally, I mean, in rain or shine, events are never a celebrity's preferred way to have the authentic experience that they are looking for in their glittery, glammy lives. And so I guess I would say I would really reconsider whether you need it. I'm seeing unbelievably successful virtual events with just, a beautiful story, a compelling 45-minute kind of virtual event put together. So maybe not a popular answer, I'm sorry, but I feel it's the right one.
I want to add a little context to that. Let me start where Alice left off. This is an interesting time to look inside our own organizations for celebrities. And by that, I mean not big names, but people super passionate about the cause who your base and your cause will relate to. So people touched by the mission, just verbally passionate about that can come across in a Zoom kind of setting very, very well. So we have our own celebrities. But I will do another piece to that because I've certainly been seeing this throughout industries. I talk to a lot of people in a lot of different industries. People at the top of the food chain are making themselves available now. Why? They're all sitting at home. Why? They have time on their hands. As busy as a lot of people are very busy, but there really is 24 hours in a day, 7 days a week. And somebody explained to me if Saturday morning's different than Tuesday afternoon for any of us, right? It's this thing. And so I first heard this through the entertainment industry, that people trying to break in all of a sudden we're able to connect with like the top corporate people, because people are feeling they want to do something, they want to give. So, and I've seen it with certain charities. They've done, you know, those kind of shoot for the moon reach outs. They're getting a response. So, you know, there's so you've got your own celebrities, but this is a chance people have time on their hands.
And I'll just
That's a great point. Go ahead, Channon.
Bianca. And it'll be quick. When you do that, I always tell people those celebrities are people too. So there's a cultivation that goes into building that relationship. There's a runway to get you to that relationship. And then there's also kind of a post runway. If you get someone, they do a great job for you, you want to stay in touch. You want to kind of keep them in the family of your organization. So I definitely agree with Alice. I don't know that you need a celebrity, but also think about what constitutes celebrity, and then really, you know, keeping them as part of your organization long-term.
And this, if I can just add this, because I think it even touches on another question that's queued up. So Andrea Mitchell from NBC is somebody who my organization knows, but I would have told you we didn't know her well. And when this opportunity came up to ask her something, we found out she really loves us. And shame on us that it took the pandemic to get that. And now I know the whole story, but we didn't know it before, right? So, and this is somebody who's on the news every day who made the time because they're people, as Shannon, they want to feel like they're doing something good. So it's a time to discover things that, you know, shame on us, we wouldn't have discovered it without this.
Thanks, Mark. And I was going to echo that. I think that whether you're talking about celebrity outreach for events or reaching out to decision makers for foundations or companies, to philanthropists, everybody is sitting at home. So think about this bold outreach, not only for your events, but for your major gifts and foundations work as well. Michelle has passed along another question here, which is, I'm on the board of a newly founded foundation. We had tremendous initial support for our launch event that we had to cancel due to COVID. It's the first and only foundation focusing on a specific disease state. What advice do you have on how to move forward on our mission, vision, and fundraising? So I know we've got a couple of disease panelists here. So Alice, you want to kick us off with how you would start, and then Mark?
I'm going to pass and let Mark take it, or let someone else take it. I want to think about it for a minute. I don't have a ready solution.
Go ahead, Mark.
So sorry, I'm going to pass up.
All right, so I'm going to try and channel my Autism Speaks days, because I was the third employee ever of that, and I remember working there. And at the end of the day, I felt jealous of everybody else in the street because they knew what their jobs were, and you know, I had no idea. There were three of us. Go, you know, and similar. I will also kind of tag with it. At ADDF, we had a big, new, exciting thing we were about to launch, and we're in the silent phase of it. And I have to be honest, we're still kind of working that through now, because there is a pause going on here. There is an absolute pause going on here. I think my advice would be to go big and public with it now. You're fighting a tide. And could you do two things? One, pull it back in. Those where there was a lot of momentum and excitement, can you get their capital or their fundraising to further help scope out and plan? And I would stall the big go, unless there's a way to put it right into the issue of COVID, which is a very crowded space right now. I would put a pause on. I just would. You know, and I take my own advice. I'd look at 18 months and I'd have 3 scenarios. You know, if by the fall things look good, is a scenario. If by next fall things look good, or is this 22?
You know, let me add to what Mark said now that I had a second to think about it. I think that one thing that would be, I think that all of those supporters who were going to go to that event are great people to have a conversation with now. And one of the things that I'm finding very persuasive in conversations that we're having with major donors is to share with them how our organization has is changing as a result of COVID. And so at the top of the call, I mentioned how the mission was changing, how fundraising was changing, and how we're looking at the future of the business. So I think as a startup, maybe it's very important for you to have a conversation that is filled with confidence and, you know, a basic plan for where you're going now in light of COVID. But I would get out to all those people who are going to go to those events, and I would have a conversation with each one of them. And I guess the other is, you know, just always have the confidence of the vision that you have for what your impact is going to be, because that's ultimately the amount of money that you can raise. So you got to, I mean, and going back to LLS, we were raising about $300 million, but we had $1 billion impact and vision. That was the gap between what we could raise and what we should be raising. I would just have the confidence in what your impact is going to be. Never lose that now or ever, and tell that story with your COVID pivot story.
And if I can jump into, Alice, I think that's a great note. I was going to say, you have a captive audience. You have people who've expressed interest in what you do. This might be the time to kind of start a low, steady drumbeat towards your bigger launch. Never thought I'd be encouraging someone to jump into direct mail, which is not my favorite thing, but you've got people at home who aren't getting much communication. Send them some literature, start to do some education around what you all do and what you focus on. So by the time you get to a space where you could have that event, you know, you're building kind of your own army behind you.
Love it. Yeah. Amy, I'm going to turn the next question over to you to kick us off, which is, do you have any insight into how institutional funders are viewing grant making this year? If the economy is hurting their assets, can we expect grants to be limited or to current grantees, or even cuts to their support? What have you all been seeing? And I imagine, Channon, this is a topic that you have some insight into as well.
Sure. I've heard it across the board from funders that I've personally spoken with. So one, my first recommendation is talk to your funders and talk to your prospects, and try to have a very, transparency is so key, especially right now. So have a very transparent conversation about where you are, where your concerns are. But I've certainly heard that some of the funders I've spoken with that we're taking care of our current folks first, our current grantees, and then we'll look and see if we have any additional funds, because we are unsure of what the end of year and what our overall budget will look like. I've heard of some that are saying that we are going to be conservative because we want to be here for the long haul ourselves, and so that will probably make us be more conservative this year in our funding. And I've heard those that said, no, we're going to give away a larger percentage of our assets if our assets go down. So it really depends on the leadership of that institution, which is why you need to be in front of them, because if you aren't in front of them talking about your needs and your goals, somebody else is. I don't know that there is one answer to that, but that would be my takeaway from it, is if you have them on your list, start talking to them.
Well said. Anything to add, Channon or anyone else?
Yeah, I think, Amy, you gave a pretty robust discussion as to what I'm hearing among other funders as well. A lot of conversations right now about no cost extensions, and people are having those direct discussions about, here's my particular issue, can you work with me? And often the answer is yes. So foundations are varying right now on what their response is. I do hear a lot of discussion about shifting the strategy. So some people are totally focused on COVID. Others may be focused on what their grant making policy or procedure or setup was before. But people are looking at this in terms of how can we respond to the needs that existed before the pandemic, but also in light of the pandemic, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and Bianca, if I could just add to what Amy said, first of all, her advice, talk to them. If they're on your list, talk to them. Expect timing and amount could be affected, and regardless, love them up, because this will end. There'll be some sense of normalcy, and you want to be that they were one of the good ones during this, even if they had to cut you, that you're still, this is fabulous, this is great, all of that.
You know, I have one thing to add to the questioner about this new health-related foundation. It's something I always wanted to do and never did. But let me just use Leukemia and Lymphoma Society as an example. I had always wanted to find the donors to hospitals, for instance, who had given to hematological cancers, pediatric blood cancers, and look and see who had given to those institutes within the hospitals and create a list of those people as major philanthropists in my field, and then find a way to get connectivity to them. So I guess I'd add there's something I always wanted to do and haven't done, and maybe you can be successful in it.
Thanks, Alice.
Yeah.
And to Amy's point, if anyone is looking for a list of who have been the biggest funders in this crisis, we have a list on our website that you can download, and we'll give you the information and follow up to this call. So we're going to do one last question, and I'll give everyone a chance to answer it. And you can answer it in the broad sense or the specific sense that this person has asked. But the question is, what's a silver lining in this pandemic? So the specific sub-question here is, have you been able to connect with donors or fundraise in ways that you wouldn't have been able to if the pandemic hadn't happened? So you can answer either the general, what's the silver lining, or that specific question. And if I know we're getting close here, so let's do the 1 or 2 sentence rule again. Who wants to start?
I'll start. I think that the silver lining from a fundraising perspective is that it has given us an opportunity from our standpoint to be bolder with ask. It's asks that we should have made before this because we could have made them, but because of the case for support, we have more confidence in making those asks, and my hope is that that will change us for the future. Really to piggyback on some of the comments Alice made, that we deserve this, we need this because the people in our communities need this, and we know that the folks that we're talking to care enough, and we should make the ask moving forward that we've been bold enough to make now.
Thanks, Amy. Channon?
I had to find the unmute button. Sorry about that. I think the silver lining is that we are really highlighting that people want to help. You know, a lot of the charities that are doing this fantastic work have been doing it for a long time, and they've been supporting people in ways that's not always seen, that sort of invisible safety net. And I think the beautiful thing about what's happening is you're seeing all of that work, and you're seeing it being highlighted in a way that really wasn't before.
Mark?
Twofold. One, this is going to sound trite. We have found there's new ways to communicate with our donors, and we can now bring in a researcher from Asia and put him in a room with 6 of our top donors, and all it is you know, scheduling. You know, it's a scheduling thing, right? So which is great. The other thing that's always in these, and it's for everybody on the call, it's the time to test that you're in it for the mission, because this is hard. Let's just be, this is hard. But if your true north is your mission, the steps that lead you out are there, and that is very empowering. So it's an opportunity for that now. We didn't want it, didn't need it, but we've got it here.
Thanks, Mark. Alice?
I guess I get to bring up the rear, and I just want to go back to a point that I mentioned earlier. For those in a federated organization, this is the time. This is the time to. We all know what the downsides of it can be, but one of the upsides is that we've got this federation that exists all across the nation that touches every community in the nation, as we do at MakeAWish, and you have the opportunity to speak as one voice, not in case of MakeAWish, 60 different voices. Speak as one voice and be able to cut through the noise. And I think this is a wonderful time to be in a federated organization and to use that power.
Well, I just want to thank you all again for your thoughtful conversation and answers. I want to thank the attendees for sticking with us for an hour and a half, and of course, Michelle and NYU for putting all of this together. As follow-up, again, if you want to see the video, share the video to this, it will be at, ready everybody, at NYU SPS CGA on Facebook, or the NYU Center for Global Affairs. The website where you can find our COVID resources, including this donation list that I mentioned, is Aperio, A-P-E-R-I-O, philanthropy.com/COVID. And we look forward to hearing from all of you about the lessons that you have learned through this crisis and how you're pivoting and preparing. Thanks again, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.